It is with great pleasure that I welcome Captain Martin Bromiley, OBE and founder of the Clinical Human Factors Group, in the waiting room. Captain Bromiley represents a lifetime of work in teaching, leadership, management, and the use of clinical human factors in changing the systems within healthcare. His lifetime of work has truly gone on to change healthcare and shown how we can learn from our mistakes and how this can go on to save lives. Martin, it's a great pleasure to welcome you and thank you for joining me in the waiting room. Tell me a little bit about the circumstances of your childhood.
So I was born in Wembley in 1963. I was a mistake. My mum and dad had met during World War II. Dad was on leave. They got married. They had a couple of children. Sadly, the first, Philip, died just after the war. But my elder brother was born in 1949, and that was it really. But I turned up as I was a mistake. I was a surprise. I turned up in 1963, and had a kind of a very normal, happy childhood, living in northwest London for a few years before my family moved out into the countryside.
The World Wars had an important impact on you, especially with some of the stories that your father told you about the World Wars and aviation. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So my dad had joined the Royal Air Force in 1938. So there was always an element of aviation in the family, if you like. And I think for me it was not only sparked an interest in aviation, but it sparked an interest in this concept of a sense of duty, really, that you do something that's right for society.
There's a very formative, seminal and important journey in your life, and I'd like to invite you to share that with us, of firstly seeing the red arrows.
It was amazing to watch them. They were doing something that I couldn't comprehend, that somebody could fly a plane like that. It was a world beyond anything I knew, and I don't know why to this day I was really drawn to it, but it just felt like something that it was so far away, so far removed from my world, that I wanted to learn more about it, and I'm not sure I can explain it more than that.
We're moving forward, but very importantly, your flying knowledge, your passion and love for aviation led you to a pleasure flight.
I was about 11 years old. I'd never flown in a plane before. I was really interested and really into it, but never actually been in an aeroplane. And so we took off and flew along the coast. I got to sit in the front, and the pilot let me take the controls for a while. And in a way, it wasn't a revelation. In a way, it was something that I completely expected and felt like I completely understood. Of course, I didn't completely understand it, but I kind of knew, I kind of felt very comfortable with it. I kind of kept track of what was going on. And it was an amazing experience to have had at that age, and the fact that I'd actually flown a plane for a little bit was absolutely brilliant as well. And I think that was absolutely a turning point for me. Unlike I think a lot of people these days, their first experience of flying will be going on holiday. I didn't actually go in a jet airliner till I was about 20 years old. It was brilliant to go and do something like that.
You knew what you needed to do to become a pilot. Can you tell us a little bit more about that from an educational point of view?
I think very early on I decided I wanted to be a fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force. That was the goal. And I remember going for careers advice, and the careers advisor said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, and she said to me, "Well, you're very good at maths, and a lot of people don't get to be a pilot, so why don't you become an accountant?" And to me it was a pointless conversation, because that I was completely and utterly fixated on flying. I couldn't see any reason why I wouldn't be able to fly. As I got to 16, I was still too young to apply to the Royal Air Force. But what they did do is they'd offer a bursary for people who wanted to go and learn to fly, get a private pilot's licence. And so I thought, well, actually what I'll do is I'll go along and I'll get a bursary, and that'll allow me to learn to fly, and I'll make sure everything's fine, so that when I do apply at 18, I'll be okay.
And one of the things I want to ask is, as you've carefully explained to us, by nature you were quite humble as a child and really would just accept and go along with what other people would say. So I want to ask, how did you feel, and what was it in you that made you negate the advice you were given that not many people go on to become a pilot?
I suppose I'd created this kind of idea in my head about what I wanted to do, and I was determined to do it, and I just couldn't see anything that would stop me doing it. And for somebody who I do think is underconfident and humble, I think it was probably pretty arrogant, if I'm being honest, when I look back at it. But it never felt like an arrogance. It felt like, no, this is what I really want to do, and I'm going to make it happen.
And something very important happened at the age of 16. During your pursuit of RAF bursaries. Can you tell us about that, and what that then led you into in terms of where your career then went into?
So, as I mentioned, you couldn't apply to the RAF at 16, but what you could do is go and apply for a bursary, a scholarship. So that's what I did, and part of the process was that you went through the same procedures as if you were applying to the Royal Air Force to be a pilot. So I went to the Officer and Aircrew Selection Centre at Biggin Hill, and they put you through, I think it was 3 days of tests. And it just so happened that the first tests that we had were the medical tests, and they did the tests and they found a problem. They basically said, you're never going to fly professionally. And I didn't quite believe that that didn't make sense. So I carried on with the rest of the tests and passed them all. I carried on with the next day's interviews and tests and things like that. And then I was called in to see one of the senior officers, and basically said, yep, so we found a medical problem, so you're never going to be a pilot. And that was that. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand it. I had never been aware of any problems I had. And that was just at the start of my 2 years of A-levels, and I think for the next 2 years, in a way my life fell apart, but in a way it didn't. In a way, I kind of spent my 2 years of A-levels actually not studying much, but just kind of getting my head around what had happened, that my whole career aspirations had changed, and I thought about jobs involving aviation, and in the end, in fact, it was my mum who saw a job advert to work with the Ministry of Defence as a civil servant at a nearby American base, and she suggested I should apply for it. I did, and I ended up going to work with the MOD straight after school. And this was completely different from anything that I'd expected to be doing. In fact, I was a receptionist in an office. I was a typist. I was doing stuff that was not in my plan. But I was working on an airbase. I was working with military personnel, a whole range of people, and I think, I thought to myself, okay, maybe this is actually quite a good career for me, and I know I'm never going to be able to fly professionally. Maybe I can fly for fun when I get a bit older or something like that. So I kind of threw myself into that career. And with always the goal of getting to work closer to aviation. And in a way, life started to happen at that stage. I'd met Elaine at that point, who would go on to become my wife. I suppose I kind of moved on, if you like, but it was always a frustration, I suppose, as I watched the aircraft launch from the airbase I was at and think, I'd really want to be doing that, but I know I can't.
This was the beginning of team management and leadership and understanding myself as a person. And can you again tell us the story of how all of this important work began for you?
So I got my promotion in the MOD to a managerial grade and ended up managing a small team, ironically an accounting team. Not that I knew anything about accounting. But it did a couple of things for me. The first thing is it allowed me to travel around and different air bases. It allowed me to talk to a lot of people about actually the aviating side of the MOD. and brief them on what we did on that side. But it also got me involved in the leadership training side as well. And I suddenly started to realise that, again, this was opening up a whole career to me now, that I could actually get professionally qualified through the Civil Service College and end up with a professional qualification in training and development. And that would be a skill that I could use in the MOD or perhaps outside. I ended up getting a job with a London-based consultancy. But one of the things I made very clear to them, I said, if we're going to be successful, you're going to have to double your failure rate. But that doubling of the failure rate was really important because it gave people the freedom, the confidence to go on and try stuff and work out what worked and not be ashamed when things went wrong. But actually, at the end of that first year, we didn't quite double the turnover, but we got very, very close to it.
Flying came back into your life, and can you tell us about how that came about?
So one of the advantages of working for this London-based consultancy was I started to earn a bit more money, and I'd kind of thought, well, maybe I should go and learn to fly. And I went along for a medical, and they said, yeah, you've got a bit of a medical issue, but you can fly privately, that's fine. And I started to learn to fly, and that was really exciting. I mean, it was expensive. And bearing in mind, young couple, no children at this stage, but with a mortgage, and it was all I really spent my money on. But it was brilliant. It was the start of a whole new life for me.
Can you educate us, Martin, on human factors?
It's about training leadership and decision making and communication and team working, etc., so that people can work more efficiently together. And latterly, we tend to talk about threat error management, that we can identify particular threats, we can identify possible errors, and we can decide on ways that help us to avoid, trap or mitigate those to be safer.
And there's a very human side to human factors, and I'd like you to kindly tell us some of the stories that were associated with that, Martin.
Tenerife was a turning point for the aviation industry. In 1977, two jumbo jets at Tenerife North. There was thick fog that was starting to clear, and a number of aircraft are diverted in there, including a Pan Am jumbo jet and a KLM jumbo jet. And essentially what happened is that they, because it was quite a small airfield, you had to get onto the runway, taxi all the way to the end and turn round to take off. And that's actually what the KLM aircraft did while the Pan Am aircraft was still on the runway. Now, what had happened is there was a confusion here in that the KLM captain, for a variety of reasons, was keen to get airborne before the fog got worse, before they ran out of their legal hours, if you like, that they would be able to fly for that day. And he was keen to get airborne. There was some confusion and terminology over the radio, but he believed they were cleared to take off and announced that they were taking off. Now, unfortunately, the flight engineer and the first officer did not believe that was the case, but weren't able to get the message across to him that they didn't believe they'd been cleared for takeoff. The Pan Am jet was still on the runway, hidden in the fog, and those two jets collided, despite actions at the last minute by both crews to avoid a disaster. A simple slip-up of communication around, and a simple ambiguity about were we cleared for takeoff, weren't we, basically cost over 500 lives, and that was the worst and still is the worst air disaster in history. So that was the kind of event that really triggered this real soul-searching in aviation about behaviours and non-technical skills and things like that. And I'd read about this stuff and I found it quite interesting, but I wasn't really flying at that stage. In 1993, I started to learn to fly. Again, it's all about the hands-on control. That's the hard bit, learning how to take off, land and fly the aircraft well. But one day, my instructor, who was very, very good, who was very experienced, in fact, he held a number of records in gliding himself, but this was learning power planes. He was teaching me to fly, a very experienced chap who happened to also be an air traffic controller, so he knew aviation really well. And the weather wasn't great one day. It was quite cloudy. It's quite low cloud. And he said, well, you know what? I know you still only got like 5 or 6 hours, but we have to do a little bit of flying in cloud as part of your flying. So why don't we just do it now? Which, on reflection, actually was a bizarre decision. But at the time, I didn't know any better. And we got airborne on this day. We flew in some cloud. Unfortunately, the cloud was quite low to the ground, and he descended. He got me to descend out of the cloud, but unfortunately, we were a bit closer to the ground than he realised, and we came very close to hitting the ground, I think, on that day. And this was a pretty terrifying experience for me. I think it frightened him as well, and I kind of went home from that thinking, well, hang on a minute. There was nothing wrong with the plane. Everything was working as it should. But we could have been killed. And it was all about something. It was about, was it decision making? Was it situational awareness? Was it, I don't know what it was, but this could have killed me. And I think really from that point I started to realise that in aviation, and it's probably true in other industries as well, and perhaps in healthcare, that you can end up in a situation where technically everything is fine, but poor decisions or poor situational awareness can be the thing that will kill you. Poor technical skills will maybe injure you, but poor non-technical skills will kill you. And I think for me that was a real turning point in my career, because I realised that I needed to give those things a lot more attention. I think it's very important in aviation. We accept that error is perfectly normal, that we will make mistakes. And I kind of call them micro errors. And what I mean by that is that if you were to sit on the flight deck of an aircraft and you understood what was happening, you would be highly, highly unlikely to witness a big mistake. It's very, very rare. But what you would witness would be some small micro errors, if you like, where somebody forgets to make a particular call, or somebody forgets to move a switch, or something like that. But what we have is a process, a way of working that means that we readily catch those errors, or we identify the potential for new errors or different threats and things like that. And we have a way of working in the flight deck. We have individual kind of processes that help us to be more resilient in our operation, but we're never perfect. But we also have a kind of a way of working together which brings resilience to the operation as well. And the key for us is when those errors happen is to catch them very quickly, by whatever means it might be. And so, for example, if I forget to select a particular switch or something, then my colleague will say, Martin, we've still got that particular switch off, or whatever it might be. And so this isn't an ego thing. This isn't catching people out. This is just trying to keep everything safe for everybody and keeping the operation resilient. And so it's just a normal, catching those micro errors is absolutely normal. And I think that's really, really important to kind of get your head round that you always aim for perfection. But I don't know anybody who's ever done the perfect flight. So what you do is you really encourage those ways of behaving. You encourage your colleagues to speak up. But actually, so what I'm trying to say is a lot of our working is actually not just about catching errors, but it's trying to create an environment which makes those errors less likely as well. It's about managing workload so that you spread out the workload. You deliberately do things at certain points or delay doing them to give you the capacity to think. You create space.
We are approaching what unfortunately were very tragic events that have truly transformed the way that we think about healthcare, the way that we think about systems, and have truly started to appreciate clinical human factors. And before I invite you to discuss those, Martin, can you please take us through the unfortunate journey that you went through and the events that unfolded in detail in 2005?
So Elaine was generally very healthy, but had suffered some sinus problems. So we saw a consultant just after Christmas who basically said, my recommendation, the safe option, would be to have an operation to clear out the sinus passages and to correct a diverted septum. So she went in on the morning of the 29th of March 2005. We decided that this is something that has never happened in the family before. So for the kids this was something different. So we decided, so they're not scared, we're going to take them with us. We went to the hospital. Went to Elaine was shown to a room where she could get changed, and the kids were there as well. And the anaesthetist came in and did his quick assessment, and he was very chatty and fine, and we met various nursing staff and all that sort of thing. And then at about 8:30 we basically left Elaine there. She was being wheeled off to be prepped, and we went off to go and do some other stuff. She had disappeared off. I get home, my brother comes and joins us at home only because he happens to be visiting by chance that day. And I remember being at home and getting a phone call just after 11 o'clock that morning. I was expecting a phone call anyway to say that everything was all right, and so I wasn't surprised. And it was the surgeon, and he said there's been some problems. I left the kids with my brother, and when I got to hospital I was met by the surgeon and by the anaesthetist, and they basically explained that her airway had collapsed, that they'd had problems getting air to her, but it was fluctuating. It wasn't kind of sustained at low levels, so that was fine. And they transferred across to intensive care as a kind of safe option. And it was probably 10, 15 minutes later that two doctors came into the waiting room and basically said, your wife has been without oxygen for a significant period of time, and we're looking at having significant brain damage. And in an instant, my whole mental model changed about what we were doing and what was happening, and just complete shock at that stage. I remember within a couple of days, one of the doctors approached me in intensive care and said, Martin, we might want to start thinking about now. We've looked at the scans. There's clearly no real hope around brain recovery here. You probably want to think about, taking her off life support. And my immediate response was yes. And they were very good, because we had a multidisciplinary team meeting not long afterwards, which I was part of, for which I was eternally grateful. And they said, Martin, we're not completely happy that is correct. So we want to consult with other people. And in fact, it took them about 2 days before they came back and say, yeah, we've done a lot of consultation, we've talked to a lot of people, and we think it is right now to remove life support. And I remember, driving in that evening to the hospital. I took the kids with me actually to go and see their mum. I didn't tell them exactly what was happening, but I expected her to die straight away. In fact, she didn't. She after life support was taken off, she survived another good few days. I suppose a strong heart, but it was the right thing to do. During the time in intensive care, Elaine was unconscious. She was in a medically induced coma, if you like. But the surgeon had come to see me. He actually came to see me, actually wrote to me as well, and basically said, that there were problems, an unexpected emergency during the anaesthetic process. It couldn't have been anticipated. The team did all the right things, but it just didn't work out. And I kind of get that. That's life, But I did expect and want some form of independent review of what happened. Not because there was any blame here, because it sounded like everything was absolutely fine, but I just hope maybe there could be some lessons that could be learned. And in the end, a review did happen under Professor Mike Harmer, who was then president of the Association of Anaesthetists of Great Britain and Ireland. And combined with what he came up with and combined what happened in the inquest, I can now have a much clearer idea of what happened, but maybe only 60-70% of all the facts. So what we know now from the inquest is that in effect that the doctors had become fixated, They were fixated on intubation as being the issue, but it wasn't. It was this can't intubate, can't ventilate was actually the issue. And while they were trying to intubate, fixating on that, then opportunities for using surgical access were lost. So the decision making became fixated. The leadership broke down. In his own words, he lost control. The senior anaesthetist said to me at the inquest, the communication dried up. But what was really telling was that each of the three doctors had a different mental model about what was happening. The idea of what was happening, what it meant, and what needed to happen wasn't shared amongst the three of them. But for the nursing and ODP staff around the outside, they could see much more clearly what was happening. And in fact, when that call for help went out, the ODP had asked one of her colleagues to bring the tracheostomy set into theatre, which you would use in that particular case. There was a quick trachea kit in theatre. And when she got in, she announced to the doctors that the trachea kit was available, but they appeared to have ignored her. And probably under the fixation, they literally didn't hear her. One of the recovery nurses came in and saw Elaine's colour, saw the vital signs, and knew instinctively this was serious. She went out, she phoned intensive care, she came back in, she told the doctors that a bed was available in intensive care. And to quote from the inquest, they appeared to ignore her, and as if to say, "What's up, you're overreacting." And in fact, of those four more junior staff present, two of them said in the inquest they knew exactly what needed to happen, but just simply didn't know how to broach the subject. So these are failings around leadership, situational awareness, team working, assertiveness, communication, all these things. But all these things, these kind of failings in non-technical skills or failings around human factors issues, as I've already said, are a major cause of accidents in aviation. And after this, it was a case of saying, well, okay, so Elaine is dead. I can't do anything about that. We've kind of established what happened. But the next question is what does that mean from here on? How does healthcare learn from this?
At that moment in time, incident reports in healthcare, death in healthcare, and in anaesthesia, what did you find when you were doing your research and search into that area?
So I think, an inquest was held because it was an unexplained death, if you like. Essentially, it's to establish what happened. And when I went into the inquest, I took a solicitor with me who was also a medical legal specialist because I wanted to ask some kind of questions, really. And I remember one of the questions I wanted to ask was from the whole team, for example. I said, I want to ask who was leading? And he kind of said to me, well, that's a stupid question to ask because it's obvious who's leading. And I said, no, I want you to ask everybody. And what we found was that when that question was asked, everybody came up with a different answer. And so over the 2 days, we kind of, using some questions like that, some obvious questions, we kind of unravelled, I think, a lot better what had happened. When we came out the inquest, so I should say that part way through the inquest, the word came back to me that, there was enough evidence for a verdict of neglect on the anaesthetist. And I said, no, that's not right, because it doesn't really reflect the totality of what happened. And in the end, we were given a narrative verdict, which is a description of what happened, which reflects on the fact that this was a whole team, and indeed there were whole system issues within this as well. And that I felt was much more useful for learning. And as I came away from that, I started to talk to people in healthcare, and I got passed on to different people who said, well, you might want to talk about this to this person because they know a bit about safety, or that person knows a bit about human factors. And over a couple of years, I built up quite an extensive email and phone list of people ranging from, clinicians who were doing work in different parts of the country through to academics and policymakers, including people world class in their field like Jim Reason and Rona Flynn and characters like that. And I kind of thought, well, there's obviously stuff going on in healthcare around safety and human factors, but it's very disjointed. Nobody seems to talk to anybody. There is no coordinated plan. And human factors particularly, even safety, was like a niche interest. And I kind of got in touch with the Department of Health in the end, and I said, look, if I can get all these people, my phone list of 80 or so people in a room for one day to talk about what's going on, would you pay for it? And they said no. So I thought, fine, I'll pay for it myself. Anyway, in the end, they did pay for it, but I got maybe 40, 50 people into a room, and a range of people, from chief execs through to world-class academics, through to doctors and nurses who were just enthusiasts, really. And we spent a day talking about it. And it realised, actually, with a bit of coordination, we could make a difference. And I said, well, how are we going to do that? And somebody said, well, you should form a charity. And I said, well, who's going to lead that? And everybody went quiet. So I said, well, I suppose I'm going to have to do that. And I think it's important to say at this point that I'm not an expert in this stuff. I'm a pilot who uses a knowledge of human factors in my day-to-day work. But what I probably have done is I've been to bring together people who genuinely are the experts. And so we founded a charity, the Clinical Human Factors Group, back in 2007. It's 13 years old now, and over the years what we have done is brought together really good people and put them in contact. So we've acted as a conduit, if you like, for when the system wants to learn from the really great people they can, when clinicians in various areas want to work on a project and want to see what has been done elsewhere, we can put people in contact. And we've been able to influence the system and bring about some systemic changes. And some of them have been quite subtle, some of them have been relatively big and high profile, like getting the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch underway and the idea of independent investigation. But a lot of it is a very subtle influencing, helping people to think about, the value of speaking up, or the value of decision-making, clarifying plans, things like that. So there's been a range of things that we've done over the years. And all of it is about just trying to promote an understanding of a science that can make it easy to do things well, and conversely hard to get it wrong.
And I know this may sound like a strange question, but I think it's probably important to ask. But how do you feel about the work that you've done, the work that your charity has done, and the important changes that you've brought about?
I sometimes hesitate to say the word I'm proud. I think what makes me really proud is when I safely and successfully fly a group of passengers from one part of the world to another. That makes me really, really proud. My work within healthcare, if I can call it work because it's all been voluntary, is a duty. And that's different, I think. But yeah, if I can allow myself to feel a bit proud, I do feel like we've done some real good, that we've helped show the light. And probably the thing that makes me proudest is when I see on social media, or I'm involved in a conversation and I hear clinicians and leaders talking about the value of human factors and talking about the work they've initiated and the work they're involved in. And I've not been involved in any of that. I've had no involvement whatsoever. I've had no influence, obviously, to what they're doing. But they are passionate, they are enthusiastic about this stuff. And that's when I feel most pride, because I think this kind of starting to embed human factors science in healthcare would have happened anyway, but it would have taken a far longer time than it's taken now. And hopefully I've helped move it along a bit. And yes, I know that lives have been saved, but hopefully, over time, the healthcare system itself is becoming safer and better in a small way, because what I have done, but mostly because of the people I've worked with have done to make a difference.